Hello, everyone. This lecture is entitled The Universe of Discourse, Part 1. The Universe of Discourse is a framework that a man named M.H. Abrams invented years ago to explain all the reasons why we communicate, and specifically for us, it will be a framework that we use to discuss all the reasons why we communicate in writing and all the characteristics associated with each of those big purposes. The universe of discourse looks like this. Notice it looks more like an umbrella than it does a table. And it's writing as art, narrative, information, and persuasion. Now, one thing to note about this particular scheme is that it's not a table. In other words, there's no clear lines drawn between each of these that separates them from each other. Instead, it's possible that writing as art can be used to persuade. You may, for example, tell a story that provides information and also leads to persuasion. So it's hard to make any of these general purposes or rhetorical purposes pure. So it looks more like a big umbrella than it does a table. This framework is based on the writer's role, and you will have a role in each of these different kinds of writing, and then also the general purpose. The first two I want to talk about are somewhat related. The first one is writing as art. Writing as art includes what we typically call the creative genres of writing. The writer is the artist. The general purpose is somewhat self-expression more than anything else. And writing as art is referred to as creative writing. The typical or traditional genres are drama or playwriting, poetry, fiction, and the fourth genre, as it's sometimes referred to, is creative nonfiction, which applies some of the elements of fiction writing, including conflict, character development, suspense, to writing about historically accurate events. Writing as art includes the purpose of self-expression. Now, self-expression means interaction with others, and that interaction may vary depending on what the artist hopes to accomplish. It may be positive, it may be negative, or it may be provocative. It's not always intended to be touchy-feely, feel-good work. Sometimes writers produce art that provokes others to action or provokes others to potentially to outrage and change. Writing as art characteristics. It's organic. In other words, material drives the form, the choice of genre, etc., etc. For example, there was probably a 2-by-2 article published in a newspaper at the turn of the last century, around 1901, that spoke of a man's murder. Along comes a playwright named Susan Glaspell, who wound up writing a short play called Trifles about that event and fictionalized the motivations behind that man's murder. She also wrote a short story called A Jury of Her Peers, and later on that was adapted into a screenplay by the same title, A Jury of Her Peers. In other words, the material found different genres through which to be presented. Subject matter can lend itself to lyrics, to poetry, to nonfiction essay, to novel, or any of another, any of a number of artistic genres. Characteristics, the point of view is indicated by pronouns, and the point of view is established as an access point to the creative endeavor. In other words, it could be written in a third-person point of view, which means there is a voice that isn't any of the characters' voices that tells us what's happening, who's speaking, etc. There's also a first-person narrator in which the writer gives the narration of the story to one of the characters and so on. Now, in art, it's often but not always the first-person genre that is used as that access point. Now, the first person looks like this. It's first person singular, I, me, my, mine, myself. First person plural, we, us, our, ours, ourselves. The point of view can also be third person, and it can be limited to behind the eyes of one character. That means we know from a disembodied voice in the story what one of the characters is thinking, what his or her motivations are, where do they vary from what the character says or does publicly, etc. Then there's also something called an omniscient narrator, and you're behind the eyes of all the characters. In other words, you know what all of them are thinking. Now, keep those characteristics in mind as we move to writing as narrative, because some of the characteristics will apply. The difference is art can be totally a created thing. In other words, a novel is not real. It's not historically factual, but if it's done well, we believe the world the writer creates in the novel. Now, the narrative is storytelling with a point, and the writer in this case is a participant and a storyteller. The storytelling with a point simply means that there is a purpose for telling this particular story, beginning, middle, and end. Okay? There's a purpose or there's a focus for the story. Sometimes those are given to you, sometimes you find them yourselves. This may include autobiography, memoir, some biography, particularly if you're writing about your own ancestry. It could include some biography. And in terms of looking at this visually, you have a subject, you have the writer, and think of this circle as the writer's whole life. Notice the writer's in the center as one of the characters. Then the writer chooses a portion of his or her life to write about. Notice it's much smaller than the whole thing. And that portion of the subject then becomes told, a story to be told to an external audience. In other words, someone who doesn't know what happened, who was involved, when and where it took place, what were the outcomes, and how did it affect the writer going down, going on with his or her life. So it typically looks like this. Sometimes it's probably better for our purposes, for the papers you're going to write for this particular purpose, that this is actually much smaller. It's a sliver. You're not in any way going to have time to write your whole autobiography in your class. Writing is narrative. Its purpose is to potentially bear witness to critical events. Some of our history is only preserved in people's stories. You can think of different types of narratives, such as the narratives of the enslaved, or the narratives of the Holocaust, or the narratives of pioneer women. There are a number of different kinds of narratives that we have the history because people wrote down their own individual stories. There are any number of those. Sharing similar experiences and identifying with others' emotions. Now, sometimes you can share similar experiences. If you've ever caught yourself thinking, been there, done that, then you've listened to someone tell a story that's also happened to you. You can also identify with others' emotions without necessarily having exactly the same experience. The experience of loss, for example, it may be that someone who has been married 65 years loses her husband, as one of my friends did. Or it could be that someone has experienced another, a different kind of loss, but you can identify with the emotion of loss without necessarily having experienced exactly the same kind. Also, diminishing isolation, which is, all of these are somewhat related. Good narrative writing can lead others to believe that they are not alone. And then finally, sometimes instructing or teaching. If you've ever said to someone, wait a minute, before you do that, let me tell you what happened to me, then whether you realize it or not, you are telling a story to instruct and perhaps persuade, I suppose. Writing is narrative. The characteristics, they're chronologically organized. That means they're time ordered. So the 5-paragraph essay structure that you may have learned doesn't work for this particular purpose, because the chronological organization means that you paragraph in particular places, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. It relies on what are called cinematic details, and that includes scenes and transitions and movements between scenes. In narratives, you typically paragraph when scenes are introduced or when they're changed, when characters important enough to give some background information about are introduced, and then also when dialogue occurs. The movement and transition are often indicated by paragraph breaks. Characteristics, narratives also rely on sensory details, which are recreated through words. Now, the senses are the 5 senses we have through which we access the world: sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. So these are more or less in the order that we use them if all 5 of them are working. Sight, we learn 90% of what we know through our sense of sight, if it's not impaired. Then sound, followed by touch. Smell and taste are very, very closely related. There's been a couple of studies that have been done over the years that have established that smell, interestingly enough, is the greatest of the 5 senses in terms of stimulating our memory. The smell of food cooking can evoke a past meal. The smell of a particular brand of soap or perfume can help us recall people, and so on. The characteristics also include the point of view, and for our purposes in this class, you're going to be writing in the first person because you're going to be telling a first-person story. You'll be doing this in a couple of papers I'm going to ask you to write. The first one is the response one, which is the literacy narrative, and you're going to talk about an event or a time that led to your acquisition of literacy in language. We'll talk more about that in class. The point of view is indicated by the pronouns, and I'm just going to put these up again, including the first person singular, first person plural. And writing is art and writing is narrative are sometimes considered the writer-centered texts. And the reason why they're called that is there is your overt presence is in them as the writer. You are the composer. You are also potentially in writing as narrative. And in the case of what we're going to do in class, you will be one of your characters, so to speak. You'll be in the story itself. The overt presence of the composer can be the self-expression of the writer as artist, or the participation of the writer in the story. That is, writer as a character. So this is the first of 3 lectures over the Universal Discourse. The next 2 will be writing as information and writing as persuasion. In Module 1, you will be working with writing as narrative. If you have any questions, please be sure to ask them in class. Thank you very much.